Okay, so picture this. It's 18th century England. Rumors are swirling about a woman, Mary Toft, and get this, they're saying she's giving birth to rabbits.
To rabbits.
Yeah, rabbits. And no, this isn't some weird fairy tale. We're talking a historical medical mystery that had everyone buzzing, even the king.
Wow. Okay, so right off the bat, I can see why this one's piqued your interest.
Yeah.
It's definitely got all the makings of a wild deep dive.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those stories that makes you question everything you thought you knew about medicine, about people, even about rabbits, honestly. But before we hop too far down that rabbit hole, pun intended,
I was wondering when that was coming.
always. But yeah, before we get too deep, we need to set the stage right. So it's 1726, and the lines between what people considered science and, well, pure superstition were a little blurry, to say the least.
Right, back when folks believed in things like spontaneous generation, that life could just appear out of nowhere, like mice popping up in a pile of grain.
Exactly. Or in this case, bunnies from a belly. But even weirder than that is this idea of maternal impression, which was huge back then.
Oh yeah, maternal impression.
Yeah.
The idea that a mother's experiences during pregnancy could actually physically impact their baby. Like imagine a pregnant woman sees a scary dog.
And then, boom, the baby's born with a birthmark shaped like a snarling canine.
That's the gist of it.
Mm-hmm.
Or let's say a pregnant woman develops a sudden craving for strawberries.
Hold on, let me guess. The baby pops out looking like a little pink fuzzy fruit.
Well, not quite. They believe the baby might have a reddish hue to their skin.
So we're saying that back in the 1700s, people would practically faint at the sight of a rabbit while pregnant, terrified their kid might pop out with whiskers.
In a way, yeah. I know it seems crazy to us now, but this belief had deep roots going all the way back to ancient Greece. Think Hippocrates. It shows you just how much influence observation and folklore had back then, often eclipsing what we'd consider scientific inquiry today.
That's such a great point. We often forget that the way people understood the world back then was completely different from our own. So, with that in mind, let's talk about Mary Toft. Here we have a young mother living in poverty in rural England, and she goes through this really strange miscarriage.
And it wasn't just the miscarriage itself that got people talking, though that alone was sadly not uncommon back then. Initially, Mary was passing what appeared to be pieces of flesh. Not unusual, right? But then the local surgeon, John Howard, enters the picture.
John Howard, the man who, inadvertently or not, helped launch one of the most bizarre chapters in medical history. And he doesn't just observe this case, he starts meticulously documenting everything as he delivers more and more of what appear to be, wait for it, animal parts.
Okay, stop right there. You're telling me she wasn't just passing rabbit parts.
That's how it gets weirder.
Yeah.
Early reports, and this is where it goes from strange to utterly bizarre, mention things like cat legs and, get this, the backbone of an eel. It's almost like someone took a gruesome shopping trip through a farmer's market.
Okay, now that's just, wow, you've got to wonder about those early reports. I mean, were they embellished,
Yeah.
exaggerated? Who knows what people actually saw or thought they saw in those moments?
Right. And that's part of what makes this whole case so fascinating. It's this weird mix of actual medical observation and then this almost mythical storytelling layered on top. But back to John Howard. It's important to remember, this guy wasn't some quack on the fringes of the medical community. He was a respected surgeon in his own right, which is why when he starts talking about a woman giving birth to animal parts, people, they listen.
They listen because he had a certain level of credibility.
Yeah.
And that's where things get really interesting.
Because it's not just medical curiosity driving him at this point, right? There's a bit of, shall we say, ambition creeping in, especially as word of this bizarre case starts to spread beyond their small village.
And let's be real, even back then, people loved a good story, especially one as outlandish as this. So Howard, fueled by this mix of genuine medical intrigue and maybe a dash of wanting to be recognized for this unbelievable discovery, he starts writing letters.
And not just to anyone. He's contacting other doctors, prominent figures in the medical community, basically spreading the word far and wide about the woman who's seemingly defying the laws of nature.
It's like the 18th century version of going viral, only instead of tweets and TikToks, you've got handwritten letters and rumors spreading through pubs and coffee houses.
Word of mouth, the original social media. And word travels fast. So fast that eventually it reaches the highest court in the land. That's right, King George III himself gets wind of this alleged rabbit-birthing woman.
Now that's some next-level gossip. You can't get much higher up the chain of command than the king. So what does he do? He dispatches his own personal surgeon, Nathaniel St. Andre, to investigate.
Nathaniel St. Andre. This guy was a big deal in London's medical circles. He was ambitious, well-respected, and now he's tasked with either confirming a medical marvel or exposing a hoax that's reached the highest levels of government. Talk about pressure.
The stakes couldn't be higher. And to add to the drama, St. Andre decides to really get to the bottom of this, so he conducts what was then considered this cutting-edge medical test, the lung float test.
Flaunt, they used a lung float test on rabbit parts.
I know, it sounds a little out there, but bear in mind, it's the 18th century, and this was considered a legitimate way to determine if a baby had been born alive.
I'm guessing PETA wasn't around back then.
No, definitely not. But anyway, the idea was, if the lungs floated, it meant the baby had breathed air. Of course, like a lot of medical knowledge back then, this method had its flaws and wasn't always accurate.
Still, the fact that Saint Andre used this test, even on rabbit parts, shows just how seriously he was taking the case. He's so convinced by what he's seeing that he goes a step further.
He publishes a pamphlet.
He does. What? Proclaiming Mary Toft as this medical marvel, the rabbit-birthing wonder of the world.
Essentially, yeah. And, spoiler alert, that decision comes back to haunt him later. But we'll get to that.
All the intrigue. But before we dive into the consequences and the unraveling of this whole bizarre story.
Because every good story needs a little more intrigue.
Exactly. And this one's got a royal twist. The king, maybe feeling a twinge of skepticism or maybe just wanting a second opinion, decides to send yet another surgeon, Cyriacus Aulers, to investigate. So now you've got two of the king's top medical minds on the case, both examining rabbit parts, and both under immense pressure to figure out what's really going on. And Aulers, he's a different breed altogether, isn't he? From what I've read, he's not as easily convinced as St. Andre.
You're right. Ahlers is immediately skeptical. I mean, you got to remember, this is a time when medical knowledge was still evolving, and Ahlers, he's bringing a healthy dose of critical thinking to this whole rabbit birthing spectacle.
So what's he doing differently? I mean, he's got to be examining the so-called evidence, the rabbit parts, but is he seeing something others aren't?
Well, for one, he's watching Mary Toft very closely, observing her behavior, and he notices something peculiar. She seems to be holding her legs together, almost as if she's, I don't know, preventing something from escaping.
Okay, that's a little too specific to ignore. It's like he's starting to suspect that those rabbits aren't hopping out naturally.
Exactly. And his suspicions grow stronger when he finally gets his hands on the supposed rabbit remains.
Exactly. What does he find? Is it a smoking gun, so to speak? Or should I say, a smoking rabbit foot?
Close. Ahlers notices something interesting about the rabbit parts. Cuts. As in incisions that don't seem like they belong there. And if that wasn't enough, he finds traces of straw and grain on the remains.
Straw and grain, that's a bit hard to explain away, even with the most imaginative interpretation of human anatomy.
You got it. It's becoming increasingly clear to Ahlers that these rabbit parts, they're not coming from Mary Toft's womb. Someone's been tampering with the evidence.
So we've got red flags going off left and right for Ahlers. You'd think he'd blow the whistle right then and there, expose the whole thing.
Well, it's not that simple. Remember, he's dealing with Saint Andre, the king's own surgeon, who's already publicly staked his reputation on Mary Toft's extraordinary deliveries.
So it's a game of medical chess, with everyone trying to make their move carefully, knowing that one wrong step could have huge consequences.
Exactly. And in the meantime, while all this is happening behind closed doors, news of Mary Toft and her rabbit babies, well, it's spreading like wildfire throughout England.
Because who doesn't love a good dose of truth is stranger than fiction, right? Even if that truth is, well, a load of bunny droppings.
Hey, you said it, not me. But you're right, this story had it all. Mystery, intrigue, and the possibility of something truly miraculous happening in the English countryside. It was the talk of the taverns, the subject of countless pamphlets and broadsides. Everyone from scholars to street sweepers had an opinion on the rabbit-breeding woman.
So we've got this media frenzy, a king who's invested in the outcome, and a medical community that's utterly divided. Some, like St. Andre, are clinging to the idea of maternal impression, trying to make sense of the unexplainable, and then there are others.
Like James Douglas.
James Douglas, the man who was like the Sherlock Holmes of 18th century medicine, he must have seen right through Mary Toft's act from the get-go.
You know, it's funny you should say that. While Douglas was a staunch advocate for evidence-based medicine and highly skeptical of anything that smacked of superstition, even he couldn't resist the allure of this case.
Really? So even the skeptics were sunk into this rabbit hole.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just about Mary Toft and her alleged ability to birth bunnies. It was about the very foundations of medical knowledge being challenged. And Douglas, being at the forefront of his field, He couldn't just sit this one out. He had to see for himself.
It's like a scientific showdown brewing. In one corner, you've got San Andre clinging to traditional beliefs, and in the other, you've got Douglas waving the banner of reason and observation. And caught in the middle of all this,
Is Mary Toft, our rabbit-birthing enigma, who's now living in the heart of London under the watchful eye of the king's own surgeon. It's like something out of a bizarre historical soap opera.
and as with any good drama, the tension is building. The question is, what happens next? Does the truth come out? And if so, how? And what about those who stake their reputations on this bizarre tale? We'll delve into all that and more when we return. So the walls are closing in, the king's own surgeon is starting to sweat, and Mary Toft. Well, I'm guessing those rabbits aren't appearing as quickly as they used to.
You could say that the jig was up. Remember Thomas Onslow, the local official we mentioned earlier?
Oh, right, the one who was sniffing around the rabbit trade?
Exactly. Well, it turns out he wasn't just sniffing around. He was actually uncovering a trail, and that trail led right back to the Toft family. Turns out someone had been buying rabbits, and I mean a lot of rabbits.
Busted. They couldn't even cover their tracks properly. I guess even back then, covering up a conspiracy was a messy business. So, what happens next? Does Mary Toft just come clean?
Well, it takes a bit more than that. See, word of Onslow's little discovery gets out, and suddenly the authorities are involved. They bring Mary and her sister-in-law, Margaret, in for questioning.
And Margaret, she was in on it too.
Oh yeah, she was deeply involved in the whole scheme.
It's always the quiet ones, isn't it? So, under pressure from the authorities, facing the very real possibility of some serious consequences,
Hmm,
what happens? Do they crack?
they do. Mary finally confesses to the whole elaborate ruse, and it's not pretty. Remember how she tried to pin it all on that story about being startled by a rabbit, trying to make it fit with the whole maternal impression idea?
Oh, please tell me she didn't try to use that as an excuse, even when the truth was coming out.
She did. It just goes to show how deeply ingrained that belief was in people's minds. Even when caught in a lie, they used it to try and explain away the unexplainable.
Unbelievable. But let's talk about the fallout, especially for our friend Mr. Nathaniel St. Andre, the king's surgeon. He'd put his neck on the line for Mary Toft. What happens to him after the truth comes out?
Well, imagine the humiliation. Here he is, a leading medical mind, author of that infamous pamphlet praising Mary Toft's extraordinary births.
Which I'm guessing was now being used as kindling in fireplaces all over London.
Pretty much. He becomes a laughingstock overnight. And in a society where reputation was everything, especially for someone in his position.
This wasn't just a career setback, it was a total demolition derby.
Exactly. This wasn't just about hurt pride, though I'm sure there was plenty of that going around. This is about the very foundations of medical authority being shaken. People started questioning everything, wondering if they could trust the word of doctors and experts.
It's like the ultimate betrayal of trust. And it makes you wonder, how did something like this, as crazy as it sounds, even gain traction in the first place?
It's a good question. I think, at its core, the Mary Toft case reveals something fascinating, maybe even a little bit unsettling, about human nature. Our willingness to believe, our fascination with the bizarre, and the ways in which those impulses can be manipulated, especially in a time when the lines between fact and fiction were blurrier than ever.
It reminds us to approach everything, even the most sensational stories, with a healthy dose of skepticism. Question everything, challenge assumptions, and never underestimate the power of a good story to cloud our judgment, even when that story involves.
Well, rabbits
Well said, because sometimes the most unbelievable tales.
are the ones we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this wild, deep dive into one of history's most bizarre medical mysteries. We'll be back soon with another fascinating story, so until then, stay curious, stay skeptical, and whatever you do, watch out for those rabbit holes.